Hello, Endeavour here. In continuing my series, Lies of the Enlightenment, I'm going to take on another lie which is a source of much delusion today. And that is the concept of human rights. It's a lie that originated in the Enlightenment era with the conception of natural rights, but today it has morphed into what we call universal human rights. The concept of human rights is foundational to the supposed legitimacy of the liberal democratic West today and is recognized as a universal good under international law. So why are human rights a lie? First, we'll go back to the root of this concept. The preposition of human rights is that all humans are born with fundamental and inalienable rights which they are entitled to as a result of being born human. They are universal and applied equally to everyone regardless of nation, ethnicity, wealth, or any other status. Though the idea of rights is ancient, the modern liberal interpretation of them is largely influenced by Enlightenment thinkers, namely John Locke. Much like the concept of the consent of the governed, which I addressed in part 2 of this series, the concept of the social contract is important when addressing natural rights. John Locke argued that inherent in the social contract between the state and the individual are a set of natural rights, those being life, liberty, and property. While Thomas Hobbes argued that, under the social contract, the only obligation of a government was to uphold order and prevent chaos, Locke argued that a government is only legitimate if it upholds the life, liberty, and property of the governed. Failure to do so rendered the government illegitimate, and the people were within their right to replace it. John Locke's philosophy was very influential on the English Bill of Rights of 1689. This included things like limits to the power of the king, freedom of speech in parliament, the right to bear arms for Protestants, and prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. In the 18th century, the philosophy of natural rights evolved again to be more universal and egalitarian. It also became a lot more secular. Thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Paine took the concept beyond simply life, liberty, and property, and argued for republicanism and the abolition of monarchy and aristocracy, on the basis that man was born equal with the same natural rights. While the English Bill of Rights was more specific to England, in the following century the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights in the United States and the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France took a much more universalist tone. They were documents that proclaimed the natural rights of man as universal, being valid in all societies at all times. The late 18th century was a turning point in the development of the philosophy of human rights. While the concept of human rights can be traced back to the age of the Enlightenment, our modern conception of human rights arose following the Second World War. In response to the brutality of the war, the newly formed United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It proclaimed standards of human dignity such as freedom from persecution, slavery, or torture, and certain rights such as freedom of thought, religion, or movement. In the following decades, the scope of human rights were expanded to include things like women's rights, minority rights, LGBT rights, and so on. Today, numerous national and international human rights bodies exist, and there is constant political debate over what is a right and what is not. So what is wrong with the concept of human rights? First of all, like almost every aspect of liberalism, the idea that a universal set of human rights exists fails to understand the nature of power. Humans in civil society are ruled by those with power, and power determines what rights exist and which ones do not. No matter which abstract rights you claim to have, the simple question remains, says who? John Locke claimed that natural rights of life, liberty, and property precede the social contract and that it's only valid if those are upheld. Now, while I do believe in the right context, life, liberty, and property can be a good thing, but they're by no means inalienable rights. They only exist insofar as you are able to defend them by force. Locke stated that if a government violated natural rights, then the governed were within their right to remove it. Well, okay, but that's only possible if you have the means of doing so by force. Otherwise, the government continues to rule, and there really is no way of ensuring your natural rights. Thomas Hobbes was correct that the basis of the social contract is the government's ability to maintain order against the brutal nature of man. And the social contract precedes any and all rights that a society rewards. Now, I want to make it clear that that's not an argument for totalitarianism. It's still desirable that a government respects the life, liberty, and property of its subjects, but rights are not a metaphysical entity which guarantee that they do this. They are subject to power and can only be upheld by force. Rights work more as an agreement between a state, a collective, and the individual. The wider society must recognize that said rights exist and that they're to be granted to members of the society. They only exist within a national context because that's the only way they can really be upheld. In order to have rights, the populace must share a culture which values said rights, and there must be a hierarchy committed to upholding them. This forms the context in which rights can exist. Abstraction cannot create a universal set of human rights because there's nothing to back it up, and the entire concept is completely arbitrary. While I disagree with John Locke that natural rights precede the social contract, at least he made a theological argument for them. While I disagree with those arguments, at least he argued they were derived from a god. What's even worse is the secularized concept of human rights, which came in the later Enlightenment, because this conception is based on absolutely nothing. And this is true of the modern conception of human rights, which have evolved since World War II. They're absolutely baseless, meaning whoever has power can claim they mean whatever they want them to. Edmund Burke said it well in his essay, Reflections on the Revolution in France. He compared the English conception of rights, which existed in the 18th century, to those that were proclaimed by the French Revolution. In England, rights found in the Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta were rooted in tradition. They existed within the national context of England at the time. The context included the monarchy, religion, culture, and heritage which dated back centuries. That context allowed those rights to exist, and those were by no means inalienable because the context could change. In the French Revolution, however, the revolutionaries tried to completely remove the entire national context in which France existed prior to 1789. The king was beheaded, the churches were shut down, the old traditions were removed in favor of a completely new understanding of universal rights, completely devoid of any national context. Burke pointed out that such baseless abstractions could be used to justify tyranny, because human rights simply meant whatever those in power wanted them to. And Burke was quickly proven correct, because these vague values of liberty, equality, and fraternity of the French Revolution were, in short order, used to justify murder, terror, and totalitarianism. Tens of thousands of people in France were murdered in the name of the Enlightenment values that the French Revolution was based on, because the revolutionaries had completely uprooted the entire foundation of French society and replaced it with a baseless conception of the rights of man. What did the rights of man mean? Whatever those in power said it meant. So once the Jacobins got into power, beheading anyone thought to be an enemy of the revolution was justified as necessary to uphold these human rights. One of the first major atrocities of the French Revolution was the September massacres. From September 2nd to 6th, 1792, sparked by revolutionary paranoia, sans-culottes and guardsmen massacred 1,200 prisoners, including women and children, in Paris. They were killed over fears of counter-revolutionary action, though the vast majority of the victims were not political prisoners, but just common criminals. They were killed brutally and without trial. On September 10th, 1792, the London Times in England wrote of the hypocrisy of the regime in Paris, supposedly founded on the universal rights of man, using these so-called rights to justify such savagery. Are these the rights of man? Is this the liberty of human nature? The most savage four-footed tyrants that range the unexplored deserts of Africa in point of tenderness rise superior to these two-legged Parisian animals. Common brutes do not prey upon each other. There is no such thing as universal human rights. They don't exist. Rights only emanate from a cohesive society with a culture and tradition which recognizes their existence and a power structure committed to defend them. And that can never be inalienable, because no matter what is written down on a piece of paper, it means nothing if it's not backed up by power. Now, here is why you should not only not be fooled into believing you are entitled to universal human rights, you should consider the assertion that they even exist as hostile. Because in the modern, globalized, liberal West, what are the so-called human rights we supposedly have today even based on? We no longer have any meaningful tradition from which they are derived. We no longer have cohesive nations capable of recognizing our rights, and we don't even have a moral or religious foundation to justify them. Much like during the French Revolution, since 1945, the foundations of our civilization have been uprooted and replaced with a universalist and vague conception of human rights. But what these human rights are is completely at the discretion of those in power. And who is in power today deciding what human rights are and what are human rights violations? It's international bodies like the UN or the EU. It's legal experts educated in the modern academy. It's NGOs funded by people like the Open Society Foundation. And it's liberal Western governments with the power to enforce them. So what exactly our human rights are is being determined by the cathedral, the power structure under which the West is ruled today, which I discussed in part 2 of this series on the consent of the governed. These organs of power are completely committed to the cause of globalism and the liquidation of the West, and the human rights they claim to be defending will just be used as a tool to justify that agenda. So it doesn't really matter what it says in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or in any national constitution in a Western country today, because it will always be interpreted through the lens of cultural Marxism. What is declared a human right and what is declared a human rights violation will be determined by what best serves their agenda. Israel being a homeland for the Jews and enforcing strong border policies, that's a human right. But homelands for Europeans where borders are enforced, that's a human rights violation. Indigenous rights are human rights, except when it comes to Europe. Europeans being dominant in their own lands is white supremacy. That's a human rights violation. White people or men succeeding in a meritocratic system where they're judged for their skills in their own damn country, that's discrimination or institutional racism. That's a human rights violation. But denying white people or men opportunities solely on the basis of their race or gender, that's not discrimination. That's affirmative action. That's a human right. An anti-white racial activist saying white people are the scum of humanity, that's free speech. That's a human right. But FBI crime statistics, average IQ numbers, demographic projections, or the early life section on Wikipedia, that's hate speech. That's a human rights violation. Chemically castrating a 7-year-old boy because he once played with a Barbie doll, or aborting a baby the day before it's ready to be born, that's a human right. But acknowledging that there's a difference between the genders and suggesting that they need to fulfill certain roles to run a stable society, that's a human rights violation. You get the idea. The vague concept of human rights today is baseless and completely arbitrary. They've been constructed by the reigning power structures as a means of advancing a more sinister agenda, which their interpretation and enforcement of human rights will always be in the service of. And they have the institutional power to do so. Just like in the French Revolution, today, tyranny is being justified under the guise of human rights. One mistake that people on the right often make is believing that they have such innate rights. For example, in America, conservatives often point to the Constitution as a guarantee on various rights, such as free speech or right to bear arms. The problem is that those with power who interpret the laws for the last 70 years have used said laws to bring about the exact opposite of what they were originally intended for. Likewise, as Vincent James of the Red Elephants has shown, as demographics in America shift, respect in wider American society for things like the First and the Second Amendment is declining. So eventually, the left will have the voting power and the institutional power to just override them. Because there are no such thing as inalienable rights. Rights need to be recognized and respected by wider society and require a power structure to enforce and defend them. Once that goes, so do your rights. So the takeaway of this video is similar to the second part of this series, but this really is one of the major failures of the Enlightenment. Just like how the consent of the governed doesn't exist, neither do universal human rights. What it all comes down to is power. And the left is fully aware of this. They just use human rights as a pretext to power, hence the aforementioned contradictions. On the right, we need to acknowledge that victory won't come from principles, but power. This is one of the fatal flaws of liberalism, the negation of power in favor of a belief in abstract principles which have no basis in human nature. If you have no power, you have no rights. There is no metaphysical entity of human rights that are going to save you from the nature of man. Your rights are what you can defend. It's not a battle over principle, but a battle over power. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. If you'd like to support my channel, I've set up a Patreon account. I tried to get onto Subscribestar, but it didn't work. Patreon will be per video, though it'll only count for edited videos like this one, so BitChute videos and live streams don't count. If you'd like to make a one-time donation, I have PayPal for that. All links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, Endeavour.